Okay, we're going to have a little look at resizing our bag with no name. Now, the commonest way for people to resize a pattern, or that I see people resizing pattern, is to print at a different ratio. So where most patterns will tell you to print at 100% or actual size, people will change that and print at 110%, so it's a bit bigger, or 85%, so it's a bit smaller. Now, this is the pattern piece for the front exterior of the bag, and that's printed at actual size, so it's the size that it should be. I've printed a second piece at 85%, and you can see it's considerably smaller. And that's, well, if I put it up against the top of the bag, if I put the two top corners together, you can see it reduces the height of the bag by just over 1.25 inches, and the width of a bag by just about 3/4 inch. That's quite a large reduction. And the problem with reducing just by printing a smaller pattern, certainly for a bag like this, which has got a gusset and got other pieces that are fitted perfectly to the original size, is that by reducing the size of the pattern pieces, you also need to reduce your seam allowance by the same amount. So if you've reduced by 15%, you need to reduce your seam allowance by 15%. Otherwise, things like the gusset and what have you will not fit to the pieces that you've got. Now, most bags are made with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you reduce the seam allowance by too much more than that, down to 1/4 inch or less than 1/4 inch, you're going to find that your bag might fall to pieces. If you don't reduce the seam allowance, then you'll find that your gussets and such like won't fit. So, is there an easier way to reduce the size of the bag? There certainly is. Now, when you reduce an entire pattern by 85% or whatever, you're also going to be reducing things like strap connectors, which obviously you can't buy strap connector hardware that's 15% smaller, so you need to think about other bits and pieces as well. So, and you'll reduce the whole bag down, so it will keep the same dimensions, but sometimes you only want to make it a bit narrower or a bit shorter or a bit taller or a bit wider. So this is how I like to do this. And this doesn't work for all patterns. It really depends how complicated the pattern is. So this is my original pattern piece. And I'm going to reduce my bag by, I'm going to make it 1.5 inches narrower. So width-wise, I'm going to take 1.5 inches out. And it's really easy to do. All I'm going to do is take 3/4 inch from the centre here. So I'm actually going to cut that off. Let's find my... And what I like to do once I've cut that off is to add the... And I will also write reduced by 1.5 inches in the centre, because if I don't, I'll pop these pattern pieces in my drawer, and when I come to make the bag again, I'll pick out the wrong pattern pieces and nothing will fit. So I've reduced the front of my bag by 3/4 inch on this side. So once it's folded, it will be 1.5 inches on both sides. So that now is 1.5 inches narrower. I need to do exactly the same with my flap. So my flap pieces, I haven't even cut these out yet, but I'll need to reduce that by 3/4 inch. I'll need to reduce the exterior back by 3/4 inch. You could reduce it by more or less, it's up to you. The exterior back bottom piece will need to be reduced in the same way. Likewise, the lining panels, and that's the bottom part of the flap. All will need to be reduced by the same amount. The other piece that will need to be reduced to make the whole thing work is the base. I haven't got that pattern piece here. The base will need to be reduced by the same amount, and the lining base. And by doing that, you will have created a bag that is exactly the same height, but is 1.5 inches narrower. Now, if you want to add height, reduce the height of the bag, in this instance, what we have to remember is that this is the measurement at the top we need to keep the same. The measurement at the bottom we need to keep the same. So find the point where the curve meets the straight edge and just mark it. Now what I would do in this instance is, if I wanted to reduce by, let's say we want to make it 1 inch shorter, is at some point on the pattern piece, and it doesn't really matter where, I'm just going to cut it in half. So I've literally made 2 pieces. I'm going to make it 1 inch shorter, so I'll take 1 inch out of this top piece just because I can. So I've made my inch shorter, and now my 2 pieces don't fit. So what am I going to do? I would glue those together, use a bit of tape to tape them together, but I haven't got my sellotape on my person. But what I'd do is I'd make a mark from this mark here, where that curve stops, that goes all the way up to that top. Let me just get my ruler straight. And you may need to redraft this on a new piece of paper to make sure that it's actually perfect, and trim off that piece so that your 2 pieces match and your side angle remains the same. You would need to do exactly the same on the lining pieces. And also on this bag you may have maybe a little more complicated, because the back part of your bag is made in 2 sections, and you want to make sure that the angle on those 2 pieces is exactly the same. So I'm just going to cut those pieces out, and I'll show you how I would do it. Please note I'm using old scissors, not my posh scissors. How many of you use your good scissors to cut out paper patterns? I hope none of you. So let's just cut these 2 pieces out, and I'll show you how I take the inch from these. You can reduce by more than 1 inch if you want to. The trouble is, the more you reduce the size of a bag or take inches out, the more you actually lose the original shape. That's the bonus of just printing smaller, but printing smaller sometimes just isn't the way forwards. If you print smaller, you don't lose the actual shape of the bag. Now on these 2 pieces, you can see at the top of this piece and the bottom of this piece, there is a straight edge. So if I overlap them slightly, you'll see that the angle of the side of the bag is there. Those 2 pieces, those straight bits there, are 3/8 of an inch, which is your seam allowance. So if I can actually even fold that over so that you can see where the seam allowance sits. So we can ignore those bits. And you can see that they sit perfectly on top of each other. So you could do exactly the same thing again. You can take 1 inch out. Make sure that you take it out from the same place as you took it out for on the first piece, on the front piece. And you can do exactly the same thing again. The best thing to do once you've done that is to actually fold those seam allowances over and place your front piece and your back piece on top of each other, so you know that they're exactly the same shape. Otherwise your bag will be different at the back than it is at the front. So if you've taken your inch out from, I don't know, 3 inches away from the bottom, make sure that you take your inch out 3 inches away from the bottom on this piece, this panel as well. You don't want to take anything from the top here ideally, but you must make sure that the top measurement and the bottom measurements stay exactly the same. Again, if you're taking width height out from a bag, then you need to do exactly the same on the lining panels also. That may mean you need to reduce the height of your slip pocket so that it still fits within your bag. And that's basically how you reduce the height of this particular bag. Now, if we are going to look at adding height or adding width, I've got the lining panel here. Again, you can add width by, if you want to add an inch to the width, you can add ½ an inch to your pattern piece on the side. But do it on the centre, because this centre bit is the straight part. So I'm only going to roughly draw that. So I've added ½ an inch. That'll be ½ an inch either side. So that will give you an inch extra width. If you're going to add height, again, add it into the centre of the bag. So cut your pattern across here. Take a separate piece of, in fact, I'm going to do that just to show you. There's my cutter gone. So I'm using a lining piece, but you would need to do this on the exterior pieces too. So I've now cut my pattern piece in half. I want to add, let's say we want to add an inch. Take a separate piece of paper. Lay the two pieces so that they're nice and even. You've added an inch into the centre, and again from this mark here where your curve finishes to that point on the top, you just need to draw a line, and that will not sit exactly on the original line. You can see that there's fractionally in from the original line, and that's where you're going to cut. You would have sellotaped these together. You've added an inch to the height. You can see how easy it is by doing that, cutting your pattern pieces and rejigging them. What you can do is continue to make the bag. You've altered the dimensions according to how much you want to alter them width-wise and height-wise, but you can still maintain the same seam allowance. Now, if you want to make your bag not quite as deep, you would have to cut the gusset pieces, and you would have to make the gusset pieces narrower. Now, this bag is only 2 inches at the top of the gusset anyway, so you wouldn't really want to do that with this particular bag. But you can, again, you take a panel out of the centre of the gusset. So you take your gusset piece, your gusset pattern piece. Let's find my gusset pattern piece. You would cut it in half and remove, I don't know, you could take out ½ an inch from either side. You could take out an inch, ½ an inch or whatever from the centre, making sure that it's symmetrical, and then stick those pieces back together. You'd have to do the same with the base of the bag. If you wanted to add width to the gusset, you could do the same thing again. Cut it in half, add ½ an inch to the gusset panels, add ½ an inch to the base gusset. Remember, you have to do the same to the lining gusset panels as well. Adding and taking away inches or measurements from printed pattern pieces, I find a lot easier to do by cutting my pattern pieces in pieces and then resticking them together and adding extra bits of paper. And we've always got plenty of extra bits from where we've cut things out into the middle to widen something. It means you can keep your original seam allowance, and you should, hopefully, everything should fit. Now, no pattern designer is ever going to guarantee that things are going to fit if you alter the pattern. So if you choose to alter a pattern, you do so at your own risk. Very few pattern designers will actually say, well, if you come a cropper, will say, well, I can fix that for you, because we design patterns at a specific size. We test them at a specific size to make sure they fit. Some patterns are produced and you get 2 or 3 sizes of pattern within the actual pattern, and that's fine, but most of mine have one size, or they're separate patterns for different sizes. So that's how I like to alter the size of my patterns. I just find it easier to either add extra width or height to the main pattern pieces. And this doesn't work for all patterns. Some patterns are just too complicated, got too many pattern pieces. If you're reducing the size of a pattern, please do remember, if there's a very large zipper pocket inside, you may need to reduce the width of the zipper pocket. If there's a slip pocket inside, you may need to reduce the width and the height of the slip pocket to fit your new size pattern pieces. It does take a little bit of thinking about, but I find this easier than just printing at 85% or 110 or 120%. Again, if you print larger than the original size, you will need to increase your seam allowance accordingly to make sure that everything fits. So that's how we reduce or increase the size of our patterns.